Dr. Sam Whiting is an academic and musician from Meanjin, Brisbane. His research focuses on issues of capital, labour and value as they relate to the creative industries and the cultural economy more broadly. In a former life, Sam was the bass player for Nico, a Brisbane band that supported iconic groups like Boris and And You Will Know Us by the Trail of Dead back in the early 2010s. Around this time, he also started working at one of Melbourne's grassroots music institutions, the Old Bar. Sam's time at the Old Bar was formative. It inspired him to go deep, writing a PhD specifically focused on small live music venues, which has recently been published as a book called Small Venues. Flash forward to now, and Dr. Sam is an expert on Australia's live music landscape with a rare, holistic perspective backed up by exhaustive research. He's a go-to figure for governments and institutions alike trying to understand what is a complex and precarious ecosystem. With festival cancellations and Live Nation in the headlines, now felt like a good time to pick Sam's brain. Is live music really in crisis in Australia? Why are these small venues so important? And what, if anything, can artists do about it? Why make music? This conversation was recorded in October 2024. Thanks for making time to do this. Are you in a busy period at the moment or taking it easy? Where are you at?
I just wrapped up a whole bunch of stuff last week. So I'm hoping to cruise to the end of the year. I've had a million different projects that I've been trying to tie up, one of which was what we presented at high school in terms of looking at the introduction of automation and the impact of AI on the Australian games industry, particularly looking at audio. But I also did a ton of media last week that I wasn't expecting that I had to fit in around the rest of what I had to do off the back of that Live Nation episode of Four Corners on the Monday night. So I ended up pumping out a conversation article with a colleague, Ben Green at Griffith. He and I write together a lot about the Australian music industries, particularly looking at like the impact of kind of what's happening, like general kind of crises in the sector from various perspectives. So we wrote an article very quickly to kind of, explicate some of what was discussed in that Four Corners episode. And then I did, I think, maybe 8 or 9 radio spots. So it was a pretty busy week. I was pretty exhausted by the time I got to Friday.
Well, I guess this is one of those situations where, Live Nation coming in and swallowing up a bunch of the Australian live music scene and just more generally the consolidation of the music industry across different sectors, industries, mini industries. It's not like that's a secret if you work in music, but it's that kind of thing where if you're a quote unquote a punter or you're just casually tuning into Four Corners to watch like a half an hour expose about those business practices probably does require a bit of debriefing and a bit of explanation. Like even in those media chats you're doing, were you finding that a lot of the interviewers on their audience's behalf were like asking you to unpack it as if it's, new news, new information?
Yeah, yes. But a lot of that's because the music industry, I think, has always been intentionally obfuscated. Like there's a lot of myths floating around the music industry that I would argue maintain a status quo that benefits a certain group of people within the music industries and disadvantages the majority, specifically musicians. I think musicians are really deeply structurally disadvantaged within the music industries globally, but also in Australia. And I think keeping the public unaware of that and keeping a sort of like a broader view of the music industries that's like very lucrative and most people who are performing are earning lots of money. A lot of people still think that's the case. They don't know about only like this tiny fraction of musicians can earn a living off of it, and only a tiny fraction of that are earning good money. So yeah, I think unpacking a lot of those myths is part of what I was doing in the media last week, following off of that. And I think the Four Corners episode on Live Nation did a great job of kind of breaking that down, because it's a complicated industry with a lot of informality and a lot of it's very deregulated, and it's very kind of like, it's almost kind of behind closed doors unless you work in the sector. So you can see why the average person would not know about the level of influence of Live Nation, or the way that most Australian musicians or other music industry stakeholders are being impacted by this kind of consolidation. Yeah. And
I noticed,
I guess
after the Four Corners, you go.
Sorry, I guess I also see, like, I'm in a really privileged position as someone who is empowered to do research into the sector, and doesn't draw an income from it. Like, I don't work in the music industry. It's like I'm an academic and a researcher, so I can, from an outside position, without it ever impacting my livelihood or my relationships, I can critique and be pretty ruthless in my assessment of what's happening without having to worry about my career prospects in the future, which is a very different story to most musicians. Like, most people in the Australian music industry, it's very difficult to navigate this publicly and call out what's happening if you're in the sector, which is why I thought it was very admirable for Bad Dreams to go on record with their statements. There was a few promoters in there, some of which are still very active, some of which are sort of the old guard who might otherwise be on the way out. And the same for Peter Garrett. He's had a career. He can kind of speak from that place of privilege. But I'm lucky that I can do that without having to worry about it impacting my long-term career.
Yeah. What can be done about that? Obviously it's a giant question and we've just got started, but hi Sam, welcome to the podcast. What can be done? How do we empower artists to be able to speak up? I feel like your answer is going to be collective action and unions, right? It's like, if we all speak together as one and no one artist gets picked on because of their take on Spotify or their take on Live Nation, and we can kind of, is that the answer here with better organising?
That's part of it, certainly. I think with a industry that's so informal, deregulated, where there's not a broader kind of voice for the workers of the sector. So it's you have to be more strategic. So I think important, influential voices speaking out and advocating to government is what makes a difference here. I mean, it would be very difficult to organize a strike for musicians or some sort of other industrial action within the sector that might impact these things or make positive change. And the level of influence that the people doing the work have within this decision making is very limited. But I would say that if you can do targeted advocacy in a strategic way to government or policymakers who might be able to make a difference, that's going to go a long way. And I think journalism and the media play an important part here, which is why I think it was great to see the ABC do that investigation. And off the back of that, you already saw the federal government responding and saying they're going to look into dynamic pricing for concert tickets specifically. And the Treasury announcing a whole, new swath of measures and funding for the ACCC to kind of bolster their capabilities. So the ACCC is empowered to do a lot of this work. And they have for a long time been fairly toothless. And I think that's probably for political reasons. I don't think the last 20 out of 30 years of coalition governments have really helped a consumer watchdog to have any sort of teeth. And I think that's slowly changing, with the supermarket and inquiry. But I would also add that, lost my train of thought. Essentially, oh no, that's right. We do not have a history of antitrust and breaking up monopolies in this country. The ACCC is empowered to investigate, big monopolies or, large corporations that have a lot of vertical integration. They're able to investigate, potentially litigate if they think they're abusing that power. But in Australia, I don't think we've ever broken up a already established monopoly or otherwise like vertically integrated business structure. What we have done is basically stopped mergers from happening. So it's sort of like the approach has been in the past, like prevention is the best cure. But when the system's already really sick, you need something a bit stronger than that. And I think, I hope that, sometime in the near future, there will be a government that is confident enough to break up some of these like very vertically integrated businesses, Live Nation being one of them that really impacts the Australian live music sector in particular.
Live Nation I saw as part of their response, I think it was actually maybe in the documentary, one of the, I wouldn't necessarily say they refuted all of the claims. It was more just like the tone of their response seemed to be like, this is just how it's done and we're not the only people who do it. And I think there was a quote along the lines of like, our business model is the same as our competitors. Do you find that's true? And part of like focusing on, like, why do you think they're picking on Live Nation? Is it because it's easier to pick on a company that is monopolizing a sector that's coming from overseas rather than looking at ways in which that kind of like swallow everything model exists in Australia as well, with Australian companies and Australian institutions?
Yeah, so there's a few reasons why Live Nation is the big bad beast of the current conversation. So TicketTech, so TEG, who owns TicketTech, who is also owned by a foreign multinational private investment firm, also engages in the same levels of vertical integration. But Live Nation has much greater control over the global music industries. So I think that sort of pernicious idea of like this, like, all-encompassing corporation that, a majority shareholder is the Saudi Arabian, sovereign wealth fund, which is controlled by the Crown Prince, who, we know has basically ordered the execution of journalists and things like that. It's not like, it's pretty nasty business. And the other thing, I think the vertical integration, Live Nation are particularly good at it, and it's a fundamental part of their business model, and it's much more aggressive than, say, TEG and TicketTech, where Live Nation basically has stake in pretty much every part of the model, from merchandise to venues to booking agencies to ticketing to concert promotion to artist management. I mean, TEG and Frontier AEG do the same. They engage in that same level of vertical integration, but not to the same extent. And I think the particularly, worrying thing about Live Nation is the way that they've bought venues, or they otherwise are co-owners of venues, and the way that they've used that leverage to muscle out independent venues or independent promoters.
I promise we won't talk about this for an hour, Sam.
We should probably move on because, yeah, I could talk about it for an hour, and that's probably the problem.
You've already done a week of media on it, but so I feel bad. But I don't know. I guess it's rare. It feels like it only happens a couple of times a year, where you notice it on the social feeds and in conversations and bumping into other musicians where, yeah, something like that Four Corners episode drops and everyone, it's almost like a sense of excitement and relief within music for artists, where they're like, oh my God, someone has seen it. Like we're
Yeah.
talking about it. And I think that's why a lot of people try and capitalize on it and continue that conversation, because it feels like the tip of the iceberg has emerged and we can all, make some inroads. Although it's funny when you're saying before about, or we were just talking about punters and how they perceive music and trying to educate more about how precarious it is, particularly for artists. I'm finding a really subtle shift, and maybe it's just in the circles I'm in and the people that I meet. But like when I meet people who don't work in music and maybe don't even have much of an interest in it, over the years, whenever they're like, oh, what do you do? And I say, oh, well, I work in music. I do all this stuff. They're always really excited to talk about it. And they meet me as a peer, as if, like that's my job. They've got their job. They're a lawyer or they're a town planner, and which probably says something about the parents I'm meeting at the parent group. But, and then they'll come to me and like, oh, I'm a musician. And they'll be like, oh, cool. So you're like, as if it's a real job, which you and I know that it's not. Now, my 9-year-old had a birthday party over the weekend at the local pool, and I met one of the dads who I hadn't met before, a new dad, and he was wearing a T-shirt, Dean Guitars. It was like a guitar brand. And I'm like, oh, he knows music. And so I'm like, do you play guitar for fun, or do you work in music? He's like, oh, no, just for fun. Are you a musician? And I went, yeah. And he went, it's pretty hard, isn't it? And I was just like, okay, this is progress. Like he was just instantly, the conversation went to how difficult it is and how he was like, but what do you do for a day job? And I'm like, okay, this is progress. It felt like an interaction I don't have very often with someone from outside of music who somehow had some understanding of it being a really different thing to be engaged in.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that is off the back of the pandemic, maybe. I think the sector's been much more vocal with how it's traveling. There's been a lot of media attention on festival cancellation. I think when it starts to impact punters and consumers and audiences, that's when they're like, oh, this thing is maybe a little bit broken. Like when people's favorite music festivals they've been going to for years start getting cancelled, and venues start closing down, and then ticket prices start skyrocketing, and you see all these new business practices. That's when it becomes a talking point. And then if you're an informed person who's a little interested in like why this is happening and might read a bit of the media around it, that's when you get through to people. And then that's when you have artists being like, it's not only impacting you, the consumer, the ticket holder, it's impacting us, the artist, as well. And so that, that sort of consciousness raising and awareness building, it's easy to form those sort of connections when you, the everyday person who might not be a musician but is a music lover and goes to concerts regularly, is starting to be really impacted on an everyday level.
Mm. Well, Sam, I want to talk about your book and your work studying live music and specifically small venues. But before, let's like backpedal a bit and try and go and get into a more human conversation, because we just went straight off the deep end there and I loved it. But I want to hear about how you got to this point where you are an academic and a researcher, and you are able to draw on obviously a lot of learning and a lot of insights, research over the years. But I want to kind of go before that to your relationship with music. I assume you're a musician first. Is that a correct assumption?
Yeah, I was. I mean, before that, I was obsessive kid. So if we want to go all the way back, I remember my dad.
Go all the way back.
My dad often tells the story of I used to sneak downstairs on a Saturday morning at about 4 a.m., 4 or 5 a.m. when I was 3 years old, so like quite little, to watch Rage before 6 a.m., which is when the top 40 started. So before 6 a.m., all the weird stuff was being programmed. It was still kind of part of the late night shift. And I think I like would wake up really early and be like, oh, if I can get downstairs and not wake anyone up, I can, see some really freaky stuff. And I have this really vivid memory. I have this really vivid memory of being around that age and seeing the video clip for Ratamahata by Sepultura, which is all claymation and like really full on, and these claymation figures running through like the jungle, because they're the Amazon, because they're Brazilian. And when I saw it when I was a kid, I didn't know what it was. I just thought it was really cool and really weird and kind of freaked me out. But then much like well into my teenage years, I actually put it together and was like, oh, that was a Sepultura video clip. And so, and I was like, I grew up in the early 90s, and TV was just such a part of like popular culture experience. And and we were a real ABC household. So I think my parents were like, oh, it's fine as long as he's watching the ABC. So Rage on a Saturday morning was like a religious experience for me. And then
I love that.
Growing
I
up,
love the idea of them being like ABC's fine, it's safe, it's but like between like 3:30 and 5 a.m. on Rage is like, well, at that time, because I also grew up in the 90s and also watched a fair bit of Rage as a teenager, and like it's literally some of the most fucked up stuff you could see on television was in that like hour or 90-minute period. Like when they do they say at the start like, Rage is rated MA, adult themes, violence, coarse language, sexual themes, nudity. Like that's where all that stuff happens, is between 3 and 4. And the idea of you as a little kid waking up to see it is like, it's similar to like the kid getting the YouTube password these days and being able to like access the most toxic stuff. Are you okay, Sam? Have you been able to process some of those videos? Like Aphex Twin and all that other stuff you might have seen?
I remember the Breathe by The Prodigy, but that was like a hit. That was a top 10 single. I remember watching that over and over again and being like, this is, that video clip is pretty dark though, with like the crocodiles in the sink and all the cockroaches crawling about. And then of course, like new metal for me was like, new metal is my culture, unfortunately. No, for better or worse. So like those early Korn video clips are pretty wild. But yeah, I think, so I, was, pretty into music growing up as a kid. But, I had a pretty, I had pretty privileged upbringing in inner city Brisbane, but I did get bullied a lot in primary school. And so I think I sort of went into music as a sort of way of just sort of dealing with that. I went into like heavier music as a way of dealing with that. And, was in, got really into Rage Against the Machine. And so I can see like there's a through line of like my love of music and where I've ended up politically as well as like culturally. I got really into music when I was a teenager. Like it was really my like core identity was walking around with a Discman on in grade 8 and listening to Rage Against the Machine and System of a Down and all these other bands of that kind of late 90s, early 2000s variety. In between lunch breaks, like any opportunity I had to listen to music, I would take it. And then everyone was playing guitar, right? Like every white young teenage boy is playing guitar. And I was like, oh man, there's so many guitarists. I guess I'll play bass, because then that'll improve my chances of being in a band. And I also I was always a bit of contrarian. I still am contrarian. I was like, I'll play bass because it's uncool. And that'll be my thing. Ended up going to the Queensland Conservatorium for a Bachelor of Music Studies degree, which was more about kind of music literature and theory and history and context and the kind of the social and cultural impact of music rather than a performance major. Because being an electric bass player, I got at the conservatorium, I got thrown in the jazz department. And I quickly realized that jazz is not a place for experimentation or originality, because it's about it's about improvisation within a very kind of limited frame of reference. So I got bored with that pretty quick. And I also got bored with the kind of competitiveness of jazz musicians. It wasn't really about pushing any boundaries other than like how many notes can you fit into this solo. Anyway, and that's kind of pushed me towards the end of the spectrum of music where I ended up, which is like being very focused on the social and cultural impact of music. And then once you get into that, you start thinking about, okay, well, how do we come up with mechanisms that support this better and increase the plurality of expression, and what are the roles for the different institutions that support this thing that I love, and how do you go from being a local band in an Australian city to like a cultural force that kind of shapes the broader discussion. And that's kind of where I ended up. Oh, and I mean, there was a journey there between studying and moving to Melbourne and doing my PhD on small live music venues, where I was kind of managing. I had an indie rock band called Nico, NIKKO. We put out 2 albums. They were pretty well received by Mess and Noise. So we had this kind of following in Melbourne that was maybe a little bit stronger than our following in Brisbane. And so we would tour there a lot. And I think at some point we just decided, let's just move to Melbourne. And the whole band moved down at the end of 2011, and I was the only member who stayed. Everyone else went back to Brisbane. And then I was working at the old bar, kind of had this idea of, this is a really, like, the old bar for me moving to Melbourne was like a really profound experience of like finding a lot of people that I had a lot in common with, which was always really difficult living in Brisbane. But in Melbourne, it came really easily and really naturally in that space. And that got me thinking of like, oh, this is a really important place for all of these people. Like a lot of these people have a lot of love for this space and this bar and this venue. And so I was like, but it's a small business. I was like, doesn't really act like a small business, doesn't make business choices that other small business would make. It's prioritizing this thing that doesn't really make it a lot of money. And then I was like, that's a really interesting dilemma. Maybe I can write a PhD about it. So that's what I ended up doing.
Yeah, I guess I'm interested to hear more about, like what that feeling was about the old bar in particular, or just in general, like that kind of light bulb moment of realizing that there was something special that you wanted to preserve, and that your skill set maybe was going to lean towards taking that bird's eye view or that academic view or whatever that might be. Like that was really interesting to hear about.
It was just like timing and a confluence of factors and just where I was in my life. I think moving to a new city, not knowing a ton of people, and going through, post-university change of lifestyle and bit of coming of age. Working at the old bar was just a way to meet a lot of people that I got along with really well. And, we had the same taste in music, but, I was experiencing and opening up to new stuff culturally. A lot of people that were really plugged in. Music scene seemed really committed and really engaged and like very friendly. I think maybe in Brisbane the music scene was, well, as a musician, the music scene in Brisbane seemed a lot more competitive, and it was maybe a case of being a, kind of a smaller pool. But also like having played in bands since I was like, 16 years old or something, you kind of had a lot of baggage around, the bands you liked and the people you wanted to play with and the venues you liked, because you brought a lot of that kind of teenage tribalism to it. Whereas moving to Melbourne in my early 20s, I was kind of shedding a lot of that. And I just found also Melbourne just like a really friendly place to be a musician. And I think a lot of it has to do with in migration, like a lot of people move to Melbourne from elsewhere to do the same thing that I did, which is to like find a community or to play music or to do something different or to leave their their, regional Victorian town, or move over from New Zealand, or move from Perth or Brisbane or Adelaide. And so everyone's kind of like, oh, I'm new to town, I don't know anyone. And then when you have like a critical mass of that, you end up meeting a lot of people very quickly because everyone's kind of trying to make connections. And I think also if you're brave enough to do that and leave your hometown and go and try and move your life somewhere, people like that are a bit more tolerant or a bit more open generally. I'd hope so. So anyway, so I just thought I was like, this is a really, and the old bar seemed like a distinct hub for those people. Like it just, all the people who worked behind the bar, a lot of them were from all over. A lot of the musicians, the regulars, there's a lot of people from regional Victoria. I know like the owners, Liam and Joel, are originally from Rosebud, and singer, is Indonesian, Malaysian. And so you had this kind of confluence of people from all over. And I felt like the Old Bar did a very good job of making a space for those people to kind of come together and have a social hub. And then, yeah, I guess having studied music formally and previously done some kind of cultural studies, I did an honors degree, which was sort of gender and heavy metal. And I'm always interested in like this kind of the capital S social. And yeah, I just thought I'd just be like, oh, I can maybe document this thing and turn it into something more than just a snapshot of this time in my life. Yeah. And then there's the whole, like, what does this mean for music? Like, what are these spaces for? So there's a whole social thing, which I think was the most important thing for me personally. But then the, like, what do these spaces mean for musicians and the music industries? And there was a through line you could see from bands like Cash Savage and the Last Drinks and the Smith Street Band and Violent Soho and all of these bands that have played the Old Bar at one time or another and then gone on to bigger and better things. And I always thought that was a really important part of those places. And a lot of those bands had a lot of respect for that venue in that they would come back and play these kind of secret shows that I thought was really interesting. Like, it wasn't just that they moved through these spaces, they would often come back and like pay homage to them and give a bit back to that space, which I always thought was really interesting.
So that leads to the PhD, which I guess also is now the book that you very kindly gave me a copy of, and it demands a closer reading than I was able to give it. I have kind of unfortunately like speed read it, which was a speed reading like an academic text is just never the best way to do it. But I'm curious, like, so it's called, the book, the final form, I guess, is called Small Venues, Precarity, Vibrancy and Live Music. And just going on the first, the precarious nature of this, like the web or the net of small venues. Alongside festivals closing, there is a narrative at the moment around venues closing around the country. And is that something that, I mean, it's a few years ago that you would have done the research for this, but is that something that you're seeing and can speak to? Like, is that really happening? I think sometimes everyone has their own kind of, their own small view of it, and you're in this position where you could actually research and take in some of the stats on a broader level. Like, are you actually seeing a serious change in the way that this like small venue ecosystem functions?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, some of the statistics are exaggerated. I mean, the 1,300 venues figure that I know APRA did some research around, that includes every stage in the country, whether it's a cover artist playing in the corner of a cafe or a bar or a dedicated live music venue. So some of those figures are a little exaggerated, but I do know a lot of smaller venues under significant stress. And that's it's much more compounded than previously. So, previously you'd have, neighbors that would complain, and the regulation on noise pollution was such that a venue could be easily shut down or heavily fined for that. I mean, that's a pretty easy, you can fix that through various legislative or zoning measures, and that's what a lot of jurisdictions did. And then you'd have, a lot of other kind of onerous things around regulation, liquor licensing, late opening hours, things that just make it difficult for venues to operate in terms of like a policy setting. And these were all venues, especially dedicated small live music venues. They already operate at pretty thin profit margins. So any change to a policy setting that might affect that is going to be very difficult to navigate. But most that were successful long term could do that, and they figured a way through. What I'm seeing now post pandemic is a whole other range of factors that have compounded these issues. So public liability insurance skyrocketed. That's a huge cost to venues. Inflation hit venues just like it hit everyone else. So the cost of produce, whether it's alcohol or food or anything else, went up. And then obviously you've got all your suppliers and contractors, them increasing their costs, and that puts a lot of pressure on venues. But then on the demand side, we're seeing really interesting behavior change in music audiences, wherein young people are still going out, but they're not drinking as much. And they're not going out as much there's a lot of data. The data is kind of still contradictory on this. Like, we know more people favor massive stadium concerts now than ever before. And a lot of that has meant a reduction in audiences for festivals, especially multi-genre festivals. But the data around whether young people or people in general are still going to local small live music venues is still kind of a bit hit and miss, because it's been lost a bit in those surveys. But what we do know for a fact is that young people are drinking a lot less. And when you have a business model where essentially liquor sales are subsidizing, putting on a live music event, then any sort of significant drop in takings over the bar is going to affect your ability long term.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that, because I think that's another thing that I feel like more people are talking about in the last couple of years than ever before, which is that, alcohol is just at the core. It's at the center of the entire live music industry, and the fact that we haven't even really started talking about it until it started falling apart is just interesting. But before we get to that, I want to go back to the idea that a lot of dedicated small live music venues, as you say, they're operating on very thin margins. They're just struggling to get by. I think you write in your book, some of them are set up sort of as non-for-profits. Well, I mean, there was at least one famous example of a non-for-profit bar in Melbourne that actually struggled to even raise any money for the charity that it was trying to support. But a lot of these venues, I think you also talk about the old bar being set up essentially not as a thing that's designed to make everybody lots of money. No one is trying to like franchise the old bar and have one in every city or anything like that. It's very much even the people running it are doing it because they acknowledge these other benefits to the community and the things that they care about. So a cynical person would sometimes look at government funding and government regulation and just see a lot of like economic mindset stuff that is running through that. Sometimes it feels like with a lot of arts and music funding, it's geared around can your venue or your label or you as an artist prove that you are generating income, because therefore we'll support you. You know, we're happy to give you money to support you if you are going to go on to stimulate the economy. You even talk about like Cash Savage or Violent Soho, like graduating from the old bar. And so like this story gets told, these stories become amplified of like, it's important to have these venues because we won't have Tame Impala or we won't have Amyl and the Sniffers, and that's the end goal. How do you incentivize or change the narratives so that maybe government, for example, they see the social value and the community value of places like the old bar that you see, you know, or do we have to keep finding these like economic success stories and hang the narrative around them?
That's a great question. So I would argue that those are not economic success stories, they're cultural success stories, because all of those bands that you mentioned, I think, are uniquely Australian and represent us on a world stage that kind of expresses, you know, our sense of humor, our take on social issues, and, you know, our specific perspective on the world. So yeah, those bands that you mentioned, although they might be economically successful, I think they're also like, it's important that we have our own music that represents, you know, the plurality of Australia as a modern multicultural nation, because that's how we know who we are. That's how we know how art is the way that we are able to reflect on who we are and where we're heading. So that would also be the argument that I'd make to policymakers, is that although you might have these rare cases where you have acts or artists that are economic and cultural successes, the most important thing about that is not whether they can, they should be able to make a living. That's incredibly important, but it's also that we're able to have a music ecosystem that promotes the diversity and plurality of our cultural experience, which is good for democracy, it's good for our society, and it also, like, you know, it raises the public imagination for like what is possible, how we might want to be represented, which I think that's the ultimate goal of art. Like, art should be a consciousness raising exercise that increases engagement in democracy. And, you know, I use democracy to think about like just civic participation, like participating in a broader community that's beyond yourself. And, you know, often we express that at the ballot box, but we also express that in the cultural experiences that we have. And so going back to your original question about, you know, this kind of creative industries narrative, which is very neoliberal, which is basically like, we'll support you if you can demonstrate that you're financially viable as a business entity. I do not think that has paid off for the arts. Like, we've continuously adopted that framing, thinking it'll get us more funding, but in the end, it's actually meant diminishing funding year on year. It's meant cuts, you know, more cuts to arts funding overall. And now a lot of the sector is really incapable of making that public good argument, the argument I was making before about the cultural value. A lot of not just the music industries, but the creative and cultural industries generally, does not have the vernacular for be like, this is good because it enhances our well-being as a collective society. It's the argument always like, this is good because the return on an investment is 3 to 1. That's what the cost benefit ratio is, 3 to 1. For every dollar you spend on music, $3 are generated more. That's a very short-term way of looking at the sector. And I also think it's like, there's a problem there where our broader consciousness is captured by this neoliberal framing generally, and we're unable to see outside of it. So I don't really blame people for always just being like, but what's the ROI? Because all of their formal schooling and all of their business training and their entire professional life has framed everything in those terms. So that's when I get more into the sort of like, we need to teach civics in school, and, you know, we need to reform education curriculum so that we're not always thinking about things in terms of finances and cost benefit. And it's basically like this broader symptom of like consultancy firms dominating like every part of our public policy ecosystem. And that's a structural long-term problem. So you can see how we're like, every time you unpick a part of this, it creates a new knotty problem. But which is why when I go to make my arguments and I go to critique, I don't start at the sort of, I always go to the top part of the problem, because that's where it starts. But yeah, I think to answer your question more fully, it's about making that exactly what Peter Garrett said on that Four Corners episode, where like a country without its own music is a country without its soul. And I think it's really important if we're going to be a modern, you know, successful nation, we need to know who we are. And without that sort of identity, and art is a really like important way of expressing that. And often it doesn't make fiscal sense to fund that art. So you need to think about other reasons for doing that. And for me, that's to enrich like what, you know, our expectations for the country, for Australia.
Okay, so going back to the idea of alcohol and how intertwined it is with live music, and you know, we've just sort of settled into that being reality. That's just like, okay, well, that's how these venues stay afloat, is that they sell alcohol over the bar, and that's part of what people want when they go to a gig. You don't go to a gig and not have a drink. That is changing because just as you said, like audience behaviors are changing. Does that mean is now the time to really start experimenting with new ways of presenting live music? Like people want to gather, people want to not just see music, but they want to be with each other. Even if a lot of the forces in our lives still try and isolate us, there is still this very human need to gather together in a community hall or in a church or whatever it might be. And I think I'd like to think that we're heading into an era where people are going to be looking more actively for that as they realize that they're not getting it in their kind of work-life balance. So is now the time to really start experimenting with new ways of coming together to listen to music? And if we are going to do that, then how do we do that? Like, who funds it, or who do we just do we need a new wave of just DIY people trying stuff? Do we need government programs that facilitate different like ideas of what live music is that aren't as conventional as the way we've been doing it?
Absolutely. I think now is the time for that, 100%. What I would say is, so what are we doing with those liquor sales? We're essentially subsidizing the rest of the business, or we're making sure that enough profit is derived over the bar so that venues can take risks. And that's not the case for all venues. I'm sure a lot of venues would get by on their room hire fees, and that, like, you know, it really, the smaller venues, the alcohol sale is certainly subsidizing the rest of the business model. So then we need to think about, okay, well, if we don't want to be so reliant on alcohol sales, we need to either bring costs down or find another way to subsidize the cultural side of what this space is doing. So on the bringing costs down factor, like rent is a really big, if you have a private landlord, you don't own the freehold to your building, rent is a really big overhead. So the Music Venue Trust in the UK, their long-term, which is a charity that is trying to reform the live music sector and basically advocates for grassroots small music venues, their long-term strategy and solution is to crowdsource funding, to purchase the freeholds to venues and run them as not-for-profits so that those communities technically own those venues outright. So that brings the costs down, and then you can, and then you're not so reliant on that subsidy model. There's that socializing, community-owned or community-run not-for-profit model. And that requires, you know, some campaigning and some fundraising. There's also the publicly owned route. Like a lot of small venues in continental Europe are owned by local governments, municipal governments, and therefore they can charge really low overheads or high fees because that venue or the maintenance of that venue is otherwise subsidized by the community through rates or taxes. And I'm seeing the emergence of this in Australia with stuff like Sydney's Inner West Council, which takes in Marrickville and like a lot of that sort of just outside of Newtown area. They just converted a lot of their town halls into performance spaces with professional PAs and equipment that can be hired out for very cheap, and you can have gigs on there. The other thing that I'm seeing, which is really promising and really cool, is, you know, I mentioned Cash Savage and the Last Drinks earlier. They're doing stuff like putting on their own gigs at community halls. So, you know, Australia has a long history of our multicultural ethnic communities purchasing property to run as community spaces that those community groups own outright. And they've owned these buildings for, you know, generations now. So they can essentially rent, you know, they can lease them out short term or hire them out at a very reduced overhead. So I know Cash did this big gig recently. I can't remember, but I can't remember which. It wasn't the Estonian House, which is just around the corner from me, but it was one of these, you know, these big community halls that community group would own. So there's those, like, space is really important. Like the provision of space is really a big factor here. So if you can cut out commercial landlords and either own these buildings outright or work with community or publicly owned spaces to bring the costs down, then you're not so reliant on liquor sales, right? And then there's other things, I think, where the other thing would be like finding other things to subsidize the cost of music, and whether that's, you know, creating a different vibe where maybe you've got music, you've got more like food available. I know like there's a lot of festivals that have kind of pivoted more towards this, like, you know, fine wine and food, but, you know, that's not going to suit every genre. But there's also just like what Music Victoria have been doing, where they're basically their 10,000 gigs fund was just like, we'll pay for the musicians at the Musicians Australia minimum rate of $250 per performance. We'll pay for that, and basically here's the performance fee, and venues can just use that to put gigs on and also use it to attract talent, because it means that it's publicly underwriting the performance fee, which means I would argue you can attract high quality acts who are going to bring more punters through. And then you still got the liquor sales, but then they're not necessarily subsidizing the cost of the rest of the gig. So there's lots of ways to do this. And I think it just takes some experimentation and some initiative and a bit of like diverse and lateral thinking. And I'm really lucky. So I'll actually be traveling to the UK and Europe around this time next year on a Churchill Fellowship to investigate a lot of these models, to see what alternative ways of running live music venues that aren't commercially leased buildings that are being subsidised by liquor sales, which is the default model in Australia. What other models are out there, and what can we bring back to Australia and maybe implement here?
What is the barrier to experimenting more in Australia? Like, it sometimes feels like there's a bit of a lack of imagination across all sort of things in music. You know, we're such creative people, people who are drawn to work in music or to be around music. But often we inevitably end up internalizing these really conventional ways of thinking about stuff. Like, how do we, maybe this goes back to what you said before, is just like teaching different things to our kids when they're in school. But, you know, how do we encourage artists to experiment and just try stuff? Or how do we educate them about some of these other models that might be happening, as you say, in continental Europe or in other cities or in other scenes?
I think being brave or being bold or brave is often a product of privilege. Like a lot of people can't afford to be bold or brave because they're in an otherwise precarious position, and so they can't take that risk, and that's completely understandable. But I think in the music industries in particularly, a lot of it suffers from a scarcity mentality, half of which is real and half of which I think is sort of manufactured or a part of the kind of systemic conditions. And so there's a lot of like, I just need to look after myself. I need to look after my venue or my band, or, you know, there's this kind of like real thing of like, oh no, we can't possibly pay musicians more because that'll mean, you know, our bottom line will decrease and we'll have to eventually close. You know, this is the kind of response you got from people around the venues around the musician's minimum rate. Whereas like I'm often like, I don't want to sound like a finance bro, but I think the music industry needs a bit more of a wealth mentality. And it's not a wealth mentality in terms of like investment and stocks, but it's more like if you pay musicians more, they will spend more money on rehearsals and recording and probably money at the venue. You know, a lot of those musicians, their spending habits are tied to their community, and a lot of that will get reinvested back into the music industries and will grow the capacity of the sector overall. And especially if you're paying musicians, like if you're just subsidizing the cost of consumption, like a lot of that will just go to Live Nation. Like if you just make it, if you, like, I don't know, I feel like events vouchers and the stuff that help consumers and audience holders and ticket holders, I don't think that's necessarily going to get invested back into the types of grassroots culture that needs help. But I think paying musicians more will. And so just to your question of like, why aren't we more creative? I think for a very long time, a lot of the music industries has had its back against the wall. And therefore has always taken like the most risk averse, safest option. And that's often something that's specific to that stakeholder that, you know, like basically them trying to protect their patch kind of territorially. Whereas I think now the sector's got nothing to lose. Like it's so structurally upside down. I think a lot of people are just, I think there's really nothing to lose by experimenting, which is why I think when you see people like Cash Savage doing something different and trying to give back to their community by putting on these events that are really kind of musician owned. And also like with the tote, we were promised from that campaign to save the tote that $3 million, that money would be invested into a fund to basically manage the freehold to the venue as a charitable trust. That is yet to materialize. I think the public should maybe be putting pressure on the new owners to see what's happened there. But it was a great idea to begin with. Basically, like, we can stump up this amount of money. Can the community stump up the other half, and we'll promise to protect this venue in perpetuity? And we have a legal mechanism to do that. I mean, I think that's a great idea, but you need to make sure that you deliver on that. So now's the time to experiment. I don't think we have anything to lose. I think being creative will go a long way at this point.
One last question, Sam, because I know that you have an interest in it and it's kind of adjacent to all of this, but basic income for artists, which, you know, has been experimented with in different parts of the world. And it's a thing that artists love to talk about or kind of, you know, I think a lot of artists hope that it's a thing that could happen in their lifetime or in this generation. Or as someone who follows the story around basic income pretty closely in Australia, like, is it on the horizon? Is it something that might happen?
I think universal basic income will be very difficult to get social license for in Australia just because of our cultural makeup. We've got the Protestant work ethic is real in Australia. and we've got a really strong streak of like no one should get a handout, which is very problematic. But basic income for artists, if you can make the argument that this is a cost-effective way to support the arts that reduces on like, you know, the level of administration it takes in to administer grant funds, and then you've got to be really good at applying for grants. Like the competitive grant funding model that we currently have for funding the arts generally is riddled with issues. And like I was saying before, a basic income for artists in the way that the Irish model is structured. So for those listeners that don't know, Ireland are in the third year of a basic income for artists trial, where essentially if you met 2 out of 3 criteria, so that was you have an established body of work, you previously earned an income from your arts practice, and that could be a very small amount, or you're a member of like an arts organization or a trade or an arts union, you only had to meet 2 out of 3 of those. So pretty low threshold to eligibility. Then you went into the pool of eligible applicants, and there was 8,000 eligible, and 2,000 recipients were selected at random. So you've got this really broad cross section of the arts community, because it was sortition was used to select those who received it. So you'd have like really established artists all the way down to like kind of semi amateurs or emerging artists, and that means that you've got this kind of amazing experiment of what happens when you just resource artists simply for being artists, and you don't put means testing on them, and you don't put work testing, work requirements on them, and you just like, here's 325 euros a week, that's what they're getting, which is around the Irish minimum wage or maybe just a bit under. Here's this should cover like basic food and rent. You still will have to work to have like a standard of living, but you're able to earn as much as you want on top of that basic income, and this is just a safety net for you. And the results have very much have been like a lot of those recipients have taken that opportunity and run with it, and they're using it to focus more and more on their creative practice. Whether to turn it into a viable, profession or not, they're really using it to kind of scale back the hours they might otherwise spend on their day job, so to speak, and spend more time on their creative practice, which will mean, I think, long term, this explosion in the Irish arts, because you've got, imagine 2,000 Australian artists, or it would probably be larger in an Australian case study, who are just out there in the community making good shit happen. I think a lot of those recipients would they would feel a lot of obligation to give back to their community through that opportunity. And I feel like that's what we're seeing in Ireland, where they would, open art spaces, or open a venue or rehearsal space, or they would reinvest in their community because that's what they care about, and that's what brings them meaning. So, the return on investment would be really quite high, but it would happen in like really interesting, experimental, systemic, grassroots ways that would like create greater cohesion and connection across the sector. Because you've just got all these people who are able just to feel secure about what they do and who they engage with. And I think when you think, it's very easy to be like, oh, this is just going to help this individual artist, but no individual artist or musician operates in a vacuum, right? They all have all these interdependent relationships, and, they have to work with other people to bring their projects to life. And a lot of those projects are dependent on specific skills or specific spaces that they frequent, whether it's rehearsal rooms or venues. So I could just see that a basic income for artists in Australia would have like a long-term generational impact, where a lot of those people might end up in very influential positions 5 to 10 years after the original, whether it's a trial or an ongoing thing, because they have been resourced from an early. And I think the case study that's really important here is like in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, when unemployment benefits were fairly easy to get and you didn't have work for the dole requirements or mutual obligations. I feel like that was a bit of a golden age in Australian culture, because you had all these comedians, actors, musicians, playwrights, just able to focus on their craft, and they had the dole to fall back on, which and I feel like a lot of those people who became prominent in the Australian creative and cultural industries at that time are still quite dominant, or like they're still fairly influential. I think comedy is the one I would often think of, like comedians, like that was a bit of a golden age for Australian comedy in particular, but music as well. So that's a point of comparison I would make.
It'd be interesting just to get a big list of all those comedians and musicians and ask how many of them were on the dole in the 90s.
It would be the vast majority of them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's interesting. Do you think there's any chance of a pilot program or a trial happening in Australia? I mean, Music Australia has a lot of extra funding that they are directing in different ways. In the last 12 months, they've announced all sorts of different programs. I mean, what are the chances of Music Australia dropping a very small trial of basic income for musicians? I actually kind of love that idea of if you meet just a couple of requirements, a couple of basic requirements, everybody applies, and then just at random, people get plucked out. Here, we're going to look after you for a couple of years and just see how it goes and see if we can measure some sort of impact from this. I mean, do you think there's an organisation or a government, state or federal, that might do it?
So there's probably about 3 ways of doing it. So Music Australia could do it, but it wouldn't be necessarily basic income. It would be more like fellowships, because it would be specific to musicians or people in the music industries. So it wouldn't necessarily be a basic income for artists. It would be sort of music fellowships. A state government could do a basic income for artists trial very easily. I think a national trial would be much harder to coordinate, because we are a federated country, and our states, especially when it comes to arts and cultural policy, our states do most of the heavy lifting on arts and cultural policy. So I think you could do a basic income for artists in somewhere like South Australia, where I was living for a while and where I was providing advice to the government. And the third thing you could do is you could fund it privately through philanthropy. So you could have a philanthropic organisation who is committed to the arts or social justice, or one of the two. They could easily, like an organisation like that, could easily do a national basic income for artists on the same scale as the Irish model, maybe 2,000 artists across the country. Yeah, but I think in terms of the public option, it would have to be a state government that would deliver that. It'd be very hard for the Commonwealth to do it, unless you did it through Music Australia or even Creative Australia. But they would probably, I would imagine, look a bit more like a fellowship than a basic income for artists.
Well, I know a lot of obscenely rich people listen to this, so maybe one of them will start up a philanthropic fellowship program after listening to this, Sam.
Fingers crossed.
We could talk for hours. Thank you for chatting with me. This has been really illuminating, and I'm glad you're out there, Sam. I'm glad you're in there talking to governments and advising on policy and writing books, and good luck for next year with the Churchill Fellowship. It sounds like the sort of the next stage of a lot of work you've already done, but kind of taking it into the next stage, which is really exciting.
Thanks, Tim. I'm very tired. So I might have been a bit rambly. I might have been a bit rambly this morning, more rambly than usual. But I really appreciate you having me. So I really enjoyed the chat. So I'd love to come back in maybe a year and we can see where things have moved.
That'd be amazing. Yes.